somewhere around 75 to 80% of all cases of osteoporosis becomes extremely brittle. You can sneeze and break your bone. Resistance training really is the primary, if not the only way, to prevent the loss of bone and certainly even to somewhat reverse it.
Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, PhD. He is one of the world's leading researchers on muscle hypertrophy. Over his career, he has published more than 300 peer-reviewed articles. He is the author of Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy and the Max Muscle Plan. Beyond academia, he has been a personal trainer and natural bodybuilding competitor.
If you're not challenging your muscles progressively, you're certainly not going to be gaining. You potentially can be regressive. The good news is that you don't need, from a basic health and wellness longevity standpoint, 2 to 3 days a week for half hour, 45 minutes a day would be sufficient to get the vast majority of your gains.
What exercises the science proves are best for growing glutes?
So I would say a couple things. Number one, there's a vertical movement pattern like a squat, and there's a horizontal movement pattern such as a hip thrust. I think combining those types of movements is beneficial.
The one question I would love to dive a little bit deeper into, if a woman's listening to this and she feels like if she's going to, let's say, get bulky by lifting heavy weights, what would you say to her?
Number one.
Okay, I am so excited for today's guest. He's such a wealth of knowledge. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, PhD. He is one of the world's leading researchers on muscle hypertrophy or muscle growth. He is the professor of exercise science at Lehman College in New York, where he directs the Human Performance Laboratory. Over his career, he has published more than 300 peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and textbooks on resistance training, body composition, and nutrition. He is the author of Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy and the Max Muscle Plan. He has received prestigious honors such as the NSCA Young Investigator of the Year and the Dwight Eisenhower Fitness Award. Beyond academia, he has been a personal trainer and natural bodybuilding competitor, which allows him to uniquely bridge cutting-edge science with practical application. Welcome to the podcast.
It's my pleasure.
Gosh, there's so many things I'm excited to speak with you about after I just wrapped up my workout. So excited to see the things I'm doing right and the things I can improve on. So I think it's important just to set the foundation of why is strength training in particular so important for health?
There's so many reasons, and in my humble opinion, it is the most important activity that you can do for your overall health and wellness. But strength training basically has effects on virtually every organ system, including the brain. So it has positive effects on mental state, on disease states that occur in mental health. And it has effects on the metabolic state, so your metabolism. It has effects on, again, virtually every organ system. But I think what's most apparent and probably what does more than any other activity. So resistance training is going to have effects on virtually every organ system in your body, including your mental health, your metabolic health, your cardiovascular health. What is obviously most relevant that most people think of, and it is certainly what resistance training does more than anything, is has effects on your physical being. So it is going to have effects on your ability to carry out activities of daily living. It's going to have effects on your posture, and it's going to, from a health standpoint, it's going to allow you to remain independent, physically independent. So one of the big issues as people age is that they lose their physical capacity, and that makes them physically dependent. Often they end up having to go into a nursing home or have some type of care. So resistance training is the only activity really that will counteract that loss of strength, which there's a name for it, and that's called sarcopenia, which is the age-related loss of muscle and strength.
I would love to, my audience is primarily women. I would love to dig a little bit deeper into the metabolic health benefits. I think this is something that's really emerging, but is not yet quite fully understood.
Yeah, so from a metabolic standpoint, I don't know how deep you want to get into the physiology, but in muscle cells, you have what are called glucose receptors. So glucose is stored in muscles and the liver as well, but the majority, much more, 5 times as much, is stored in your muscles. It's the primary storage bin for glucose. And diabetes, or insulin resistance, is an inability for glucose to enter the cell, the muscle cells. There are receptors at the top of the muscle cell, at the on the membrane of the muscle cell that allow glucose in. Resistance training makes that more receptive. The receptor is more receptive to receiving glucose. But importantly, within the cell, there are these glucose transporters, and resistance training, quote unquote, wakes up these glucose transporters. And basically, the glucose transporters are responsible for shuttling the glucose from the cell surface into the cell. So, in multiple ways, there are positive effects on metabolic health. And by the way, I would say, particularly with women, one of the other really important factors with resistance training is that it has very important effects on bone health. So certainly it's important for men as well, but women represent last statistics I heard was somewhere around 75 to 80% of all cases of osteoporosis, which is a porous bone condition. It's basically where the bone becomes extremely brittle, and you can sneeze and break your bone in severe cases. Resistance training really is the primary, if not the only way, to prevent the loss of bone, and certainly even to somewhat reverse it even as you're older. So certainly the best remedy is to start resistance training early in life. You build up what's called a bone bank, and that's particularly important in women who, first of all, they start out with less bone because women generally have smaller bone structures. And estrogen is osteogenic, means it helps to produce bone. When women go through menopause, they lose this osteogenic capacity. And after menopause, there is often a very large loss of bone. There's certain factors with your bone types of women who have smaller bones are more prone to it. Asian women tend to be more prone, and white women as well tend to be more prone. But so there are certain population-based, demographic-based aspects. But all women are going to be more prone to it than men. And again, the only way to really reverse it is to resistance train.
Is there a specific type of resistance training that can be most beneficial for bone health? I do a lot of I do a lot of resistance training like compound lifting, but then I also do some jumping like either jump rope or things like that. What would be the best ways for women that might either have some bone loss or they want to prevent that?
Yeah, so bone remodeling is very specific to the joints, to working the joints themselves. So yeah, so let's say jumping, has ground reaction force, is a terrific way to prevent and even to remodel, to improve bone health for your lower body, for your femur. So the primary areas that osteoporosis occurs, it can happen anywhere, but generally it's the femur, which is the leg bone, in the hip areas, usually it's the upper femur, the spine, and the wrist. You will get some benefits as well for the spine. It's really not going to do anything for the wrist. So again, for total bone health, you need to do a variety of exercises that target all the relevant joints.
What would you say is the best for the wrist? Like a curl? Is that working the wrist for the bone or what's best?
I mean, certainly that would be one, but dumbbell rows would be great, bench press. So again, it's not only doesn't have to directly, you don't have to you could do wrist curls, which is dynamic, but even from a stabilization standpoint, if you're doing, let's say, a bench press or a shoulder press, your wrist, the bones in your wrist will stabilize that function, and thus they will be active during the function.
Well, thank you. I'm gonna definitely have to make sure I'm hitting all of these different areas. I do like a DEXA once a year to just keep an eye out on my bone density, and things seem to be going well. But also, I'm grateful that I started strength training pretty early, and I'm a woman who I love adding more weight, so would also love to talk about that a little bit. I think that the narrative is changing a lot for women. I have a friend actually, maybe you've heard of her. Her name's JJ Virgin, and she said that years ago, women only had these like fitness salons where it was like these tiny little weights and it was like all pink. First of all, I'm just mind blown by this fitness salon thing. And then, but now we are really more up to speed. So for women particularly, what do you think, is the best exercises to do? We have heard a lot about strength. Should we be training for strength? Should we be training for hypertrophy? What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, so I'll start off by saying there are still some fitness influencers who remain nameless who are preaching that women should never lift more than like a pound. We have 2 pound dumbbells. Yeah,
Goodness.
I mean, women's purses often are more than a pound or 2 pounds. But it's just it to me. This is a myths that I've been fighting for many years, and they're hard to die sometimes. It's kind of I don't want to get bulky women, a philosophy that a lot of women have grown up with, that it's not feminine, muscle isn't feminine. These are just silly myths. But when you say what are the best exercise, there are no best exercises. Basically to number one, resistance training is going to be specific to what your goals are. If you want to get maximal strength, you need to lift heavier loads. If you want to focus more on hypertrophy, virtually any loading realm in terms of repetitions, up to 30 plus repetitions are fine. So you can make hypertrophy, which is muscle growth, can be achieved across a very wide spectrum of loading ranges. Now, the key is that you need to push close to failure for hypertrophy. So hypertrophy means that you need to be, when I say means, to train for it, it means that you need to be really pushing yourself so that you're within a rep or two of what's called muscle failure, where you can't lift and do another repetition. Strength, you do not have to be as close to failure, but you need to be lifting heavier loads. So there's different ways to train for different goals. For muscle power, which is the ability to lift heavier loads explosively, meaning that you're able to move weights fast. There's a principle of specificity, so you need to do more ballistic type training, explosive training. So there is no overall optimal way to train. It is always going to be specific to your goals. And as far as exercises, the only time there would be a specific exercise is if there was a competition that you did that exercise was needed. Like a powerlifting competition is usually the bench, the deadlift, and the squat. If you're going to be a powerlifter, you want to use all three of those exercises in your training. But for the vast majority of people, what I always say is choose exercises that you enjoy. The most important thing with any exercise, and resistance training is no exception, it's to adhere to the program. You need to do it consistently. And really, the biggest problem is only 20% of the population adheres to a regimented resistance training. It might even be less, certainly over time. So to get gains, you have to train really for life. Or I shouldn't say to get gains is easy, but to maintain the gains and to continue gaining, you need to make this a lifetime habit. You don't stop brushing your teeth and say, well, I achieved tooth health, so now I don't have to brush my teeth anymore. There is a use it or lose it principle that once you stop, you will reverse the gains that you made. So look, there's going to be discomfort. So there's no way around that. You're going to have to push your body, but you can make it less onerous. You can make it more enjoyable by choosing certain things that you enjoy more.
Yeah. If you were to design, let's say, like the ultimate longevity fitness protocol, would you put strength, like training specifically for strength, maybe also a little bit of hypertrophy, but also power into that weekly cadence?
Yeah, look, so when I mentioned the principle of specificity, that would be if you have a specific goal. If your overall goal is longevity, so it's not like if you do hypertrophy training, you're not going to gain strength or power. You will. You're just not going to optimize those components. And so if you are someone who has, let's say an athlete would have a specific goal, a bodybuilder is going to focus on hypertrophy because that is the goal of the competition. Whether a bodybuilder gets strong or not is secondary to developing their physique. On the other hand, a powerlifter doesn't care. They might care what they look like, but for the purpose of the competition, it really has no bearing. So if you are just the person in general, the Gen Pop, um, I would say kind of doing a combination is probably best. You don't focus on one or the other. You know, having a variety of this, so doing some heavier load training, some moderate to lighter load training, and doing some more explosive type training in various permutations, various configurations would be probably ideal, but you just got to get in the lift. Like the vast majority of longevity is just going to be from dedication to the gym. As long as the two primary things you have to have proper effort, even so strength, you don't have to come as close to failure, but you still got to challenge your muscles. If you're not challenging your muscles progressively, you're certainly not going to be gaining, and you potentially can be regressing over time. And so you got to train with sufficient effort, and you have to be consistent. So the good news is that you don't need, from a basic health and wellness longevity standpoint, 2 to 3 days a week for half hour, 45 minutes a day will be sufficient to get the vast majority of your gains to from a longevity standpoint. Now, again, is that going to make you a champion bodybuilder? No. Is that going to make you a champion powerlifter? No. Or a champion weightlifter? But outside or an athlete, outside of more specialized goals for the Gen Pop, you can accomplish a lot with a fairly minimalistic routine.
Yeah, I think that's important to focus on. If you're listening to this and just starting out, I mean, obviously the most important thing is just to get started, right? And that seems super doable, 2 to 3 times per week for 30 minutes or so. I love that.
E- Everyone should be able to fit that into their schedule.
I
Uh, if not, then you need time management skills because
Well, I can assure you that someone's scrolling on their phone for more than 30 minutes, 2 to 3 times per week. So,
and you could do it at your home too.
yeah.
So I mean, there are body weight exercises you could do. You could just purchase some adjustable dumbbells. So it doesn't take a lot of space, even if you have a space challenge in terms of the amount of in New York, a lot of people have a studio apartment. You could tuck away some adjustable dumbbells in a corner and a bench really, and that's all you need for a fitness type workout to get you decent results.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. It was interesting. I kind of did a little experiment when we just moved to this home. I was obviously going to a regular gym in LA, but I didn't really have much equipment at all. I had like two 10-pound dumbbells and one 50-pound kettlebell and a mat, and that was it. And I measure, it's not the most accurate, but I measure on a bioimpedance scale every week if I'm losing muscle or gaining fat. And, I was actually able, with the right amount of just effort from, I guess, my mental effort and making sure I was feeling something while I was doing these workouts, I was actually able to maintain and even add a little bit of muscle mass during those few months. So I was really surprised by that.
Yeah, and maintenance requires even less time in terms of volume. So to gain more, like if you really want to continue gaining, there's a certain amount you need. Generally, you need more volume. But once you've achieved a given, this particularly for muscle development, once you've achieved a given level of muscularity, you can maintain that with sufficiently less volume, much less.
Yeah. As it relates to volume, is there a minimum threshold if we want to be gaining muscle that we need to hit? Or is it more so about just, going to near failure?
So from a hypertrophy standpoint, we have general guidelines, and what I would say is minimum effective dose is probably somewhere around 4 to 6 sets per muscle per week.
Okay.
So again, that can be accomplished. I published a study, or I should say, my lab published a study. Kudos, I'll give a shout out to my master's student who led the study, Tom Herman. Was published in the Medicine, Science, Sports, and Exercise a few months ago, where we looked at minimum dose training for these were advanced, I should say, they were trained lifters, trained male and female lifters, and they were doing 4 to 6 sets per muscle per week. It was 2 half-hour sessions that they were able to get in 4 to 6 sets per muscle per week. One set of multiple different 10 different exercises in a session. It's basically like 10 sets twice a week for different exercises for their different muscle groups. And yeah, they actually made some gains. So not only didn't they lose, now again, it depends upon how much muscle you end up having. A bodybuilder who's very muscular might need a little more than that. So again, this really it's not something people always want hard uh, examples or hard recommendations, and that's difficult to give your research. Different people have different needs, genetics will enter into it to some extent. But what I would say is that that gives a decent gauge that the fairly minimalistic routine, a couple days a week, 30 minutes to 45 minutes, for the vast majority of people should be sufficient.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you. You've also often discussed there's three mechanisms of hypertrophy: mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and then muscle damage. Can you explain that a little bit to us?
Yeah, I want to preface that I know that that is often attributed to me. There are three proposed mechanisms. It doesn't mean those are necessarily mechanisms. These are they're theorized mechanisms. So and my opinion is somewhat shifted over the years as far as their relevance. So the three mechanisms are mechanic or and by the way, there are some others as well, but the three primary proposed mechanisms have been mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. It's become increasingly clear, and it certainly has been clear for a long time, that mechanical tension is the primary driver of hypertrophy. Mechanical tension basically is the force that is imposed on a muscle, which causes the body to convert those forces into chemical signals. And that's kind of as simple as I can make it. So within the muscle, there's this, it's called mechanotransduction, which is the conversion of a mechanical signal into a chemical signal, and that drives what is called muscle protein synthesis, or primarily drives it. Certainly, that is what initiates the initial what we call upstream response for hypertrophy is through mechanical signaling, and probably down from there as well. Now, other proposed mechanisms, metabolic stress, has to do with metabolites that are produced during training. Um, and they are generally more produced in more higher repetition training, uh, often with higher volumes. Um, so anyway, again, I don't know how deep you want to get into that, but the validity of that is much more. So whether that is a factor is still in question, in my opinion. There is certainly some evidence with various metabolites, including lactate, that they serve as signals for hypertrophy. And basically, we have what are called signals and sensors. So a signal would be something that provides a stimuli to a sensor, which picks up the signal and then transduces that into these chemical signals that carry out muscle protein synthesis. And again, I'm being overly simplistic here because I certainly want to keep this more general. Um, but there's evidence against it as well. I'd also say there are dozens and dozens of metabolites that have been shown to be produced during resistance training, and the vast majority have not been studied to this point. So where the other metabolites, we've only studied a few. Alpha ketoglutarate another one that has some evidence showing that it may be involved, their metabolites. So we don't know. If I would also say, in my opinion, based on the literature, if it does have an effect, number one, we're not sure whether the effect is additive to the mechanical stimuli, meaning that are you getting less mechanical tension and then you added the metabolic stress that brings you up to a point where if you had more mechanical signals, they'd be even. We don't know that. And we also don't know the extent to which it is involved. But if it is, I would say it's likely fairly small. Like mechanical tension reigns supreme, and that any other stimuli, at least from what we can determine now, would be less. And the final one is muscle damage. That is one where my thoughts have become sufficiently less confident. Not that I was ever highly confident, but I probably would have said I felt moderately confident that it had some effect, and I would say my confidence is weighing in that regard now because of various information that's come out. If you want to get into some specifics, on when muscle damage is severe, it has effects that are hypertrophic. There are certain functions that are upregulated. So satellite cells, which are heavily involved in muscle growth, are activated. Various inflammatory responses, acute inflammatory responses, which have been shown to be involved in hypertrophy, are increased. However, severe muscle damage is going to be a net negative. So if you had severe muscle damage, you're not going to be able to train. So it doesn't matter whether you're upregulating other processes if you're not able to train. That's a net negative. So my hypothesis was always that there may be a sweet spot where if you got mild to somewhat moderate muscle damage, you can get the benefits and still be able to train effectively. Well, the emerging information seems to show that we don't. It doesn't show that these positive effects like satellite cells and the inflammatory markers, acute inflammatory markers, are activated after milder muscle damage. And if that's the case, that really takes away the central aspect of the theory. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So, I mean, especially if you're new to working out, right? And then you go super hard and then you are taken out of the ability to work out, right? I mean, that's not going to be optimal. So, probably the recommendation would be to just start at the like 30-minute intervals that you've been discussing instead of just trying to push yourself to the max.
Yeah. So I certainly would say that you do not want. Some people judge your workout, the quality of a workout, based on how sore they get. Like they're walking out like Frankenstein, where they can't lift their arms over their head, and their legs are so stiff they can't bend their knees. These are, and sort of like the next day with me, even when I say walking out, really the effects of muscle damage are late. There's a latency to it, usually 24 to 48 hours. So what really manifests is the next day and the day after, etc. That's a net negative. That's never a good strategy. There's no evidence that that is beneficial. It's going to have negative effects on your ability to train. So yeah, at the beginning, when it's not just it's even less than volume. It's the effort that you put in. So the first several weeks of starting out, you should not be challenging you should be at a RPE, a rating of perceived exertion, on a 1 to 10 scale of a 5, meaning that it's somewhat hard, a little bit. I felt it a little, but you want to, week one, you're just looking to gain proficiency in the movements. You're not looking to really challenge your body. It's after several weeks to a month where you then can really start to push yourself towards that challenging effect I was talking about. But the beginning phase of training, the first several weeks, the goal, in my humble opinion, should always be on just getting form, learning the movement patterns. Is a safety factor, and it's also just going to help you in terms of targeting the muscle properly and avoiding injury.
Yeah. What about any eccentric and, concentric? So I've had trainers that have written my workouts that have really wanted me to count every second of, you know, a lift of some kind. And then I've had other trainers that haven't ever mentioned that. So is that important at all? And if so, how much?
Zero or virtually. So what I would say is interesting you asked that. We just published, well, it's online now, but we just got acceptance on the meta-analysis, which is basically a study of studies, where we look at the results of all the studies on the topic. We did this for tempo. So the question was, does tempo have an effect on muscle growth for hypertrophy? Not at all. Uh, there was no difference between very fast or very slow movements, eccentric and concentric. Now, I will say this, despite that, I would say that you want to lower the weight. You don't have to count, but you should be controlling the weight. You shouldn't just be letting the weight. You are just going like a lawnmower where you're going up and down really fast. The negative, the concentric action is fine. It's not going to generally have a negative effect. But on the lowering aspect, on the eccentric aspect, number one, there's a potential for injury in that the joint is more predisposed to injury on a fast negative, fast eccentric. And also, the muscle is not resisting gravity. So when you're lowering the weight, you want to have some resistance. If the muscle isn't doing any work, then you're not getting any results. So I would say you don't have to count, but make sure that it's sufficiently controlled where you're probably not going to be able to lower it in a controlled fashion less than 1 to 2 seconds. But you don't have to count it. I mean, you just need to lower it so that the muscle is doing the work.
What about the mind-muscle connection? How important is that, if at all?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we don't have a lot of evidence on it. So to date, uh, there's a bunch of EMG studies which measures muscle activation. So basically, what is the drive to the muscle? It's called neural drive. And they do show that when you get a mind muscle connection is where, just for those who don't know, it's where you're thinking about the muscle as you're lifting the weight. So you're thinking about, like if you're working up doing a bicep curl, you're thinking about squeezing the biceps on your concentric action. It does increase the activation of the target muscle. There's not good evidence that EMG necessarily transposes to actual muscle growth. So or certainly when I say there's not good evidence, there is inconsistent evidence on that. Our group did the only study to date that actually measured muscle growth under those conditions. And we had bicep curls and leg extensions in a group of cohorts. One did a mind muscle connection, the other group just focused on getting the weight up. And in the biceps, there was a difference favoring the mind muscle connection. In the quadriceps, there was no difference. So it's hard to give to rectify the results or reconcile the results. What I would say is that it's possible that it was easier to get a mind muscle connection for the biceps. Most people tend to be able to feel the muscles in their arms. When I say feel them, think about them and squeeze them more than they do the lower body muscles. But it's still speculative and without really good evidence. It's something I can't give a hard opinion on. What I would say to this point, I always use a mind muscle connection. I think that there's no negative effect of it, and there may be a positive effect. So in the absence of evidence, you don't say, well, we don't have evidence, so I don't do anything. I mean, you still want to try to make an informed decision based upon logic and what we know. And I would say that it has a good cost benefit. So in my opinion, I would suggest if your goal is hypertrophy, using my muscle. And by the way, if your goal is power, do not use a mind muscle connection. You just want to get the weight up as quick as you can. That's what I talked about earlier. That's specificity. So really the mind muscle connection would be more specific to hypertrophy goals. And if your goals are either strength or power oriented, if they're focused on completing the movement of an exercise, we have pretty good evidence that it's better to use an external focus, meaning that you just focus on the movement itself, getting the weight up.
Great. Um, we're really like in this time that Pilates has just exploded. Um, I think just the rate of the classes, the influencers online are all showing like kind of, a little bit shredded physiques. And they're saying that Pilates is like how this has occurred. What are your thoughts on that? Is Pilates, maybe a few times a week a sufficient exercise routine in your opinion?
I think it's fine. I think all exercise is good. I don't think it is a substitute for resistance training. And the main reason you don't, at least in the Pilates that I've seen, now again, that's not my area of expertise. I've done a couple of classes in Pilates where people have invited me to their studio or put me through a cortical Pilates workout. So there might be different approaches, but you're not taxing your body close to fatigue, challenging your body close to failure. So you're not going to optimize results, as I mentioned. And the submaximal, it's more muscle endurance. If your goal is muscle endurance, it can be I think, an effective approach for that particular outcome. Uh, Again, and this is based on my limited experience with the modality, but I do not believe, based on my experience, that it is a substitute there is no substitute for resistance training where you are challenging your body beyond its present capacity.
This one also might be slightly out of your wheelhouse, but I'm just going to ask for mostly myself, but also the other women listening. What exercises do you feel or that the science proves are best for growing glutes?
Yeah, so there's not specific exercises per se, but there are exercise patterns. So as I said, there's no exercise you have to do. Like a squat, it's a great exercise and it does grow the glutes well. So I would say a couple things. Number one, there's a vertical movement pattern, like a squat or a leg press would be considered a vertical movement pattern where the movement is going vertical. And there's a horizontal movement pattern, such as a hip thrust. I think combining those types of movements is beneficial. So doing some vertical movement, having whether it's a squat, a leg press, a hack squat, that lunge would be a vertical movement pattern. If you're going to do squats or any type of vertical movement patterns, you need to go deep for the glutes. So if you're just doing these shallow squats or lunges like a lot of people do, you're going to work more your quads. You really need to have a stretch in the glutes to, at least that's the evidence that we have at this point. So like for a squat, you need to go quote unquote ass to grass or close to it as low as you can go. And if you're not able to, if you have limitations, joint limitations, that might not be a great exercise for you. You might want to choose a different movement that allows you to get greater knee flexion so that you're able to get greater hip extension. With the hip thrusts, they're a terrific movement. And again, I think they are complementary. We don't have a lot of evidence that shows the combinations. We have a few studies that have looked at hip thrusts versus squats, and they seem to show similar growth, but there's reason to believe that the combination of such is might be superior. I'll give a shout out to my best bud, Brett Contreras. If I didn't mention the hip thrust, he probably told me.
Is there any truth to the idea that some exercises are growing the top of the glutes versus like the more middle bottom section?
Yeah, there are. So again, and this is where I was going to get to. So there's also abduction, meaning that it's doing like a lateral raise of your hip raise. So there's machines that you can use. The inner outer would be called the outer thigh machine, quote unquote, and they work the gluteus medius. They also work portions of the gluteus maximus that would tend to be involved in what you're talking about. So I think this is where combining movements is a net benefit. So if you're doing, you would need for full gluteal development. So there are three glute muscles. There's gluteus maximus, which is the largest gluteal muscle, gluteus medius, next largest, and then the minimus. And they basically form like an onion where the maximus sits above the medius, which sits above the minimus. And to fully work them, you need a variety of exercises. And I actually collaborated with Brett on a paper probably a dozen years ago now or 10 years ago, but where we actually modeled, and actually Brett did the modeling of different types of vertical moves. So we looked at it like a good morning. So stiff like a deadlift would be another, I think, very relevant move for the glutes, gluteus maximus. But where an RDL or a good morning exercise has different effects than a 45-degree hyperextension, back extension, versus a flat hyperextension. Basically, it's there are zones that we talked about, loading zones, where the muscle is actually loaded differently at different points. And conceivably, that could provide more complete glute development. Now, it's not like you need one of these exercises every workout. Basically, trying to get a variety of the movements across a given cycle, which could be several weeks to a month, just working in different movements. And I would just leave it, give a plug to my bud Brett if you want a lot of info on that. He does a ton of informative posts on his Instagram.
Yeah. Yeah. I love his work. And definitely, I've seen some great glute growth from his page. So that's wonderful.
Yay. The expert matter.
Yeah. So I want to just talk about any known. So it's, very common now that I think women are hearing a lot of differences in what their workout routine should be. What does the science say, or what are you aware of, even with all your years of experience? Should women be training differently than men? If so, in what way, or not at all?
Yeah, generally not. So it's a good question, and I know a question I get asked a lot, but there's very little difference in the response. And actually, women gain muscle similarly to men on the same routine, except they're on a relative basis. So meaning that like if a man gets 10% gains on average, women get 10% gains on average from a given routine, roughly. Men are going to gain more absolute muscle because they're starting with more muscle. So percent would be the same, but on an absolute basis, there's a greater amount of gains for the men. There are some things that women tend to recover more readily. First of all, between sets, for a given, let's say if they're resting a minute, women can generally keep more of the uh, do as many, close to the same repetitions with a given amount of weight. Or let me put it this way: men will lose more repetitions on the succeeding sets at a given rest interval, and even coming back because women seem to get less muscle damage. So they seem to have better recovery between sets and are able to uh, potentially not need as much recovery between bouts. But that's always going to be specific to the individual. This is on average. It's not like every woman, just like every guy, doesn't respond the same. You ultimately, I can give generalizations based on research, which reports the means, but we can't. People are not mean. They're not averages. They're individuals. So when I give these types of recommendations, they are meant to be done as to give guidelines, and then you have to figure out what works best for the individual. Within those guidelines, it gives you a starting point, and you can then, see your own way.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And I think it's just yeah, it's helpful because there is so much kind of noise out there about maybe women should be training totally different or doing, different protocols. So, I think that is really helpful. The one question I would love to dive a little bit deeper into. So, if a woman's listening to this and she feels like if she's going to, let's say, get bulky by lifting heavy weights, what would you say to her?
Yeah, I did before, but I forgot to mention too, there also is no credence or very little credence to needing to vary your training based on menstrual cycle. So I know there's a lot going on now, like, the teal phase. There are various theories or hypotheses as to how women should train within the phases. And there's a very good study recently published by a colleague of mine, Lauren Colenso, which basically showed that muscle protein synthesis was the same regardless of when the fat phasic training of a woman within her cycle. So basically, just train as you see fit. Women, of course, have different experiences with symptoms during the cycle. So that's something that would be individual, and that you're always going to need to vary your training based upon how you feel. But on a general basis, there's no rules as far as that goes. As far as getting bulky, what I would say is bulky is specific to the individual. Number one, women start out with less muscle. Um, so women, even though they gain similar amounts of muscle on a percentage basis, it doesn't show as much because you're not gaining, they're gaining percent, an amount that is substantially less than men because they start smaller. But what I would say is that muscle is generally very pleasing, and if a woman feels that they're getting too quote unquote bulky, it's very easy to lose muscle. It's very difficult to build a lot of muscle. So most women have difficulty getting to what most women would think would be quote unquote bulky. It's not like you start lifting weights and all of a sudden you're like this. So it takes time. It takes a good amount of time to gain muscle. So it's very easy to remedy if you feel that you're gaining too much muscle. And if women had that problem, God bless, because I should have that problem.
Okay, well, I wanna transition, unless there's anything else that you have that you think is really important to say about, muscle growth or hypertrophy, but I wanna talk a little bit about nutrition.
Sure.
Okay. All right. So as it relates to pre-fueling, post-fueling, what does the data say? Do we need to be as women, particularly training fed, or do we need to be eating within the 30-minute window? What does this look like?
What's your goal?
Let's just say the goal for now is just health, overall health.
So, look, what I would say from a performance standpoint, particularly if you're doing more anaerobic type exercise, so high intensity interval training type exercise, um, moderate or bodybuilding style resistance training, hypertrophy oriented resistance training, it relies on glucose for fuel. You need a certain minimum amount of carbohydrate. Generally, that's going to be somewhere around 150 to 200 grams per day, but that's again a very basic recommendation. If you want to optimize, you might need more, but you need to have glycogen stores. Your muscles' glycogen needs to be stocked with glycogen to be able to perform at a high level. The timing really doesn't matter for that unless you're doing like 2 a day workouts. If you're a real athlete, you have a 2 a day or competitions. That's when fueling becomes much more of a science, and there could be reasons why you want to fuel immediately post workout after your first workout of the day in particular. But otherwise, it's about getting carbohydrates across the day, getting a sufficient amount of them. And protein, again, pretty much the same within. If you train in a fasted state, then it's going to be more important to get your protein fairly close to when you finish your workout, or fairly close to after the finish of your workout. So within an hour, 45 minutes, an hour. The closer you get, generally the better. Assuming you're trading first thing in the morning fasted. But if you had something to eat in the morning and you're training later in the day, there's very little rationale. And if you're eating 3 to 4 meals a day, like most people do, and if you're on an intermittent fasting schedule, that might throw things off a little. But if you're eating 3 to 4 meals a day, you'll always be within quote unquote a window. So these are things that for the Gen Pop are just overthought. And I think there are things that get in the way of adherence to make people stressed about training, which is never a good thing.
Yeah. And where do you fall on, let's just say we can parse out either you're maintaining maintenance or you want to grow muscle. What would you say about protein intake? Because it's a very hot topic right now.
Yeah, so certainly if you are lifting weights, and everyone should, as hopefully I've convinced everyone by now, you need roughly double the amount, at least double the amount of protein as a sedentary individual. That comes to around, I'll give it in kilograms for the foreigners, for what I say foreigners, I'm in the US. So those outside of the US is still the only country I think that uses the imperial scales. So it's in roughly 1.6 to around 2.2 kilograms per pound of ideal body weight, I would say. Yeah, so when you're lean. So if you're going to be around 10%, because this is a question that always gets asked, it's based on body weight, but when they're doing these studies, the men are at 10 to 12% body fat, somewhere in that range, 12%, and the women are somewhere around 20% body fat. So a lean woman or a lean man. If you are overweight, you don't base it on if you're 300 pounds and you're 5'2" as a woman, that's not going to be your lean body. If you're 40% body fat, you don't base it on your weight at that point. You base it on what you would weigh if you were 10% body fat. So somewhere around 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram. And that equates to around 0.8 to 1.01 gram per pound of body weight. And it doesn't matter whether it's men or women, both men or women are going to have the same recommendation.
Do you have any, I know this might not be your area of expertise either, but increasing protein with, menopause. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I've not seen where that is relevant. I will say a couple things though. If you are in a deficit, if you are dieting, you generally need some more protein, or certainly more than the 1.6, I would say. Want to be on the higher side, maybe up at 1 gram per pound, your 0.8 grams per pound, to one, perhaps even a little more to prevent muscle loss. Part of it depends on how quickly you're losing the weight if you're on a more rapid weight loss plan. I've not seen specifics to menopause, but older individuals generally need more per dose. So the amount of protein they're going to get in the feeding generally should be somewhat higher to reach what's called the leucine threshold, which is leucine is one of the essential amino acids that kind of initiates the protein synthetic process, particularly post-exercise. So you want to have a little more leucine in your meal. You could either increase the leucine content or just consume more protein.
Do you have any numbers, maybe where, for a younger individual, how much protein is ideal at each meal versus an older individual?
I don't like to say even ideal because there's some conflicting evidence on that. So there's been some evidence that like 30 to 40 grams of protein in a meal for young individuals who are doing total body resistance training. I don't want to even say optimized because they didn't have a comparative condition, was best. So with that, let's put it this way, that 40 grams was better than 20. They didn't have a 30-gram condition. So we don't know if 40 was greater than 30. And they didn't have a 60 gram, so we don't know if 60 might have been greater than 40. There was another recent one that showed a 100-gram dose was better than a 25-gram dose. But again, no in between. What I would say is there has been in older individuals, I think that's a little more clear because there was a recent study that looked at zero, so basically a placebo, carbohydrate placebo, versus 15 grams versus 30 versus 45. And there was a dose response relationship where 45 grams had a greater protein synthesis response than 30 grams in a given meal. And that was post-exercise. So they did a resistance training bout, then they had protein after the workout, and the higher amount got a greater protein synthesis response.
I want to go back really quick to exercise. So, what is the science-backed best between set time? I've heard 3 minutes. I've heard shorter.
Yes, we had a meta-analysis on this topic, and it showed somewhere between 90 seconds to 2 minutes. So 60 seconds, basically we stratified by seconds, minutes, and that 1 minute seemed to have inferior results, suboptimal results. It's not like it obliterated the gains, but it was worse than the 90 seconds and above. It was hard to tease out because there are other factors. People think that we have all these studies. We really don't. This was a meta-analysis, and there was only, I think, 9 or 10 total studies that have been done on it. So it's hard to stratify out. There was, you start to look at what about multi-joint versus single joint. A squat is going to have different effects with different rest periods than a leg extension will. So where I kind of see the literature at this point, my recommendations are for your more difficult maneuvers, squats, rows, presses, 2 minutes or perhaps a little more is probably where you want to be. And for your less complex movements, your single joint, dumbbell curl, or leg extension, 90 seconds probably is sufficient.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. My last question is on creatine, also incredibly popular topic right now. Have you guys seen any massive benefits? I mean, do you take creatine yourself?
Yeah, so interesting you bring that up. We did a meta-analysis on this a little over a year ago. And it's the one supplement that really does have some efficacy as a muscle building supplement. Gains that you get, it's been overhyped in my opinion to some extent. Like when we quantified how much gains you have, they're fairly modest. But certainly you're not getting steroid-like effects. Like some people kind of make this like they even think creatine is a steroid or something. It's not. It's 3 different amino acids. So but there certainly are benefits. Now, when I say that, it depends upon certain things. One thing in particular is your meat consumption. So creatine is very replete in meat-based products, fish. So if you eat a lot of meat, particularly higher amounts, like a carnivore diet would be something, you probably are not going to see much benefit from creatine. On the other hand, if you are vegan, vegetarian, certainly vegan, they can see substantially more gains. So that's where you can see pretty big discrepancies, and you can get quite large gains if you're a vegan. If you're asking, do I take it? I have taken it. It doesn't sit well in my stomach. So and I do consume a good amount of pescatarian, but I consume a lot of fish. So never seemed to get much benefit. So I'm assuming that my creatine stores were pretty well stocked, and it it kind of gave me indigestion, or my stomach was not feeling well after. And I've tried different forms of it.
How much were you taking?
Basic 5 gram a day dosage.
Yeah.
So I mean, could I have cut back? Well, I could have cut back, let's say 3 grams. Um, Usually, if 5 wasn't doing much, 3 certainly would have not. It's not like you take less and you get better results. So
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, because now, like, we're hearing about these mega doses, right? Like, for even not even just muscle related, but like brain health and things of that nature, like 20 grams. I mean, I have not done those doses, but I could imagine that would upset my stomach as well.
yeah, and look, this again is not my area of expertise. The other, I'm a muscle physiologist, but I've certainly done some looking into as far as brain health. It might be the case, but from what I've seen, from the data I've seen, and I've looked into it, seen some of these meta-analyses, we're drawing conclusions on very limited data. I would be very hesitant to draw anything close to a strong conclusion. I think the data, again, in my humble opinion, it's not my area of expertise, but I think the data are relatively weak on that topic. Creatine on the good side is, other than some gastrointestinal issue, potential gastrointestinal issues, it's not, there's no evidence that it has negative health effects. Now, we don't have a dosage, very high dosage. So people are taking very large dosages. There may be negative effects that they don't know about, but if you're taking relatively modest dosages, it's worth trying, I guess. But I, I, I remain skeptical until we have that evidence.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Where can people find you?
I always say just Google me. You'll find all you need.
Easy enough. Well, we'll make sure to include your website and your Instagram and your social media handles in the show notes. But it's been such a pleasure chatting and learning from you.
My question.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.